We have an audience from, I know, from around the world, but I'm just curious, with a show of hands, how many in the audience have been to the GCC, have been to the Middle East? Okay, so most of the audience. Could you keep your hands up if you've been to Bahrain? Wow, so quite a large number of people who are actually experienced in Bahrain. Let's start with really your area of responsibility. Just explain to me the scope of responsibility that the Economic Development Board has.
I'd summarize it by saying there's really three areas that we are responsible for, and they're interrelated. The first is it's setting economic strategy. So we are responsible for kind of looking forward and deciding what sectors the country should focus on to generate growth. The second element is actually to define the sectors, think about the value proposition, and then reach out to the investors. So we have 14 offices around the world, and we have sector teams that are responsible for talking to those investors and attracting them to the country. And the third element, which is critical, is around developing policy advocacy around the issues that would ease doing business. But if I was to summarize all of that, our real objective is creating jobs. So all of this is about creating jobs that would be value added, that would be desired by the nationals of the country.
This session is called Post-Oil Crisis, the restructuring economies in a post-oil crisis. What has the oil crisis meant to you achieving those objectives?
Well, first of all, it's a new, we don't even think of it as a crisis. We think of it as a new normal. We think that, and I think this is mirrored across the Gulf. And it's the reason why you see countries around the Gulf beginning to think, or oil exporting countries in general, I should say, beginning to think about how to restructure their economies to deal with this new normal. And the new normal is one in which supply of oil through shale and fracking has changed the economics of alternative supplies of oil. And we think that you can see countries in the US and elsewhere where you can extract oil through fracking at prices as low as $30. And then you look at the supply, the demand side, and while we think that that's somewhere down the road, we think that there is going to be a difference in terms of alternative energy, electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles. So the dynamics in oil have changed, that it is really a new normal. And I think that in light of that, I wouldn't call it a crisis. I'd call it, this is the new reality. You have to adapt to that new reality. And it's going to require, most countries are thinking about two things. One is, how do I diversify my economy so that I am less reliant on just the oil sector to drive growth and to drive job creation? And in Bahrain, we've succeeded in doing that since the 60s. We now have 80% of our GDP coming from the non-oil sector. Financial services represents about 18% of our GDP. It's the second largest sector after oil. We have manufacturing, logistics, ICT. So in that element, we've succeeded. We still have more work to do, but we are probably, together with the United Arab Emirates, amongst the most diversified in the GCC. But the second element that is a challenge for every country, and it would apply to a country, it would apply to a corporate. If you saw, as happened between 2014 and 2015, if you saw 60% of your revenue just disappear in a period of 6 months, we went from $100 oil to $40 oil. And as I've said, I don't think we'll recover the $100 oil anytime soon, or perhaps ever. If you've seen that, if you were a company, you would struggle to deal with that new reality. And I think the challenge for the countries in the Middle East right now and the GCC is, how do I build up my revenue as a government so that I can continue to provide the services to citizens? So it's about, in Bahrain, we still have 80% of our revenue from the government reliant on oil, and that's mirrored in every other country in the Gulf. And so the new reality is forcing governments to think about taxes. So we have excise taxes coming in, VAT. These are all consumption taxes. And I think it's wise by the governments to think of taxes around consumption rather than income. But this is the new reality that the governments have to deal with.
We're hearing a lot about your neighbors up the road with Vision 2030 in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. How does that affect what you're trying to do in Bahrain? And can you just say something about how it affects not just you in Bahrain, but the whole region? Because obviously it's not really a zero-sum game.
Yeah, I think we get asked that a lot. How does this plan affect Bahrain, or how does what the UAE, what Dubai is doing affect Saudi Arabia and so forth? And you said it, we don't think it's a zero-sum game. Why in Asia do you have Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Indonesia, now Vietnam, all coexisting, all doing well, all growing? We call them the tiger economies. But we look at the Middle East, we kind of think of it as a zero-sum game. Why do we think that the success of Saudi will detract from the success of its neighbors? And I don't believe that's the case. Dubai, by its successful strategy in tourism, attracted traffic to the GCC, to the Gulf, and every country around the region has benefited from that. People perhaps started by visiting Dubai, but now they think of, let me go explore Oman. After you've come twice or three times, you will stop in Dubai, but you'll go to Oman, you'll go to Bahrain, you'll go to Kuwait. So the success of Dubai has had success for everybody in the GCC. So we look at Vision 2030, and it's an ambitious vision, it's a bold vision, it's going to have benefits for the entire region. We just saw, I was in Riyadh for the Future Investment Initiative, and I saw some of the top CEOs in the world in Riyadh, and they stopped over in other cities in the Gulf just because they were in Riyadh. And that's just a small example of how Vision 2030 and what Saudi is doing will have ripple effects that are going to be of benefit to the entire Gulf.
Do you, looking at the human capital, at your young people that are going and getting educated, quite a few Bahrainis who have been educated here in Harvard and elsewhere in the US and around the world, they must leave to go and get educated. How do you attract them back, and what's the strategy for making sure that talent that leaves the country, and I'm sure it's the same in every other country in your region, it's the same in other parts of the world, how do you attract people back, the young people back?
Right. Well, I spent 14 years of my life before I went back home outside. I spent 6 of it between undergraduate and graduate here in the United States. I then spent about 8 years working in the United Kingdom, in London. And I did it because I wanted opportunity of finding a fulfilling career. So I'd say the first thing that's changing now in the Middle East is that you're seeing the McKinseys of this world, the Googles of this world, the Facebooks of this world having offices in the region. That wasn't the case 24, 25 years ago when I first graduated. And so I think that the opportunity of having first-class employers in the region is changing. But I think that's not sufficient. I think the reason why, and the biggest risk that we have in the Middle East is our brain drain. Our smartest and most talented individuals are coming here to the United States or to Europe because they actually want a level playing field. And I think until we change in the Middle East, truly change, that what you know is more important than who you know, removing this feeling that I'm never going to get my chance and my opportunity unless I'm from a certain family or connected to somebody. Until we really address that, it's going to make people feel that, as Indira Gandhi said, it's our people. Back in the 60s, she said, our most talented are succeeding elsewhere. So it's not our people. It's something wrong in our own country that is not allowing them to see success as being achieved in our own country. And so I think it's similar in the Middle East. So our next challenge is, how do we make it a level playing field? How do we remove this perception of not having a level playing field? And I think it's a work in progress.
If you are able to attract young people back, they're going to be coming back as young potential executives and young entrepreneurs. Do you have a strategy to stimulate and encourage entrepreneurship?
Yeah, so I think we look at the biggest challenge for the Middle East as jobs, job creation. Fadi was talking about it earlier today, and I think you can look at different statistics. I think the World Economic Forum says the Middle East would need to create about 100 million jobs in the next 4 or 5 years. Huge amount of jobs. We're never going to be able to create it just by attracting FDI. We're going to have to look at unconventional ways of creating opportunities, or else we're going to have a major problem. We're going to lose our best and brightest, who will go elsewhere, and we'll be a ticking time bomb in the Middle East because there's going to be a buildup of frustration. There's going to be a buildup of all of these college graduates who are not going to be able to reach their aspirations and their fulfillment. And so I think in Bahrain, we look at it from that perspective, and I don't think we're alone. We've created a brand called Startup Bahrain. And we've said this is going to be community-led, and we're going to allow, through at least instigating it through the government, for it to be a community of entrepreneurs, startups, and we wanted to give it a name and a brand and help instigate as a catalyst, whether it's the social media, the team, the community building. So we started with that. The other element we were looking at is, we don't believe the government is best placed to drive this. The government should be a facilitator. And so the view that we have is we want to be a hub for entrepreneurs, but we're not going to limit it to nationals. We actually want to be able to welcome entrepreneurs and startups. They could be from Morocco, they can be from Tunisia, they can be from Egypt. There's a need for this across the Middle East. So we're not going to be building a platform that is just for our nationals. And we have an entity that was established about 10 years ago. It's called Temkeen. And it basically has, over the last 10 years, given out $1.5 billion in grants. It's given it to 30,000 businesses, 100,000 startups, and it's not limited to nationals. Anybody who sets up a commercial enterprise in Bahrain can basically have an ability to obtain a grant to do their feasibility study, to help train. There's a checklist of what you can apply for. So we want to make that available because, again, why? Because a startup that comes in, and it's proven scientifically, is going to be creating more jobs than a mature company. When you first ramp up, if you're successful, you're going to create 10, 20, 30 jobs, can go to 100. So if we're after job creation, it's probably going to be the fastest way to create job creation. And again, moving from unconventional ways. So instead of making people think as employees, make them think like employers. We're now also adding to that, because we think that mentorship and guidance is key, is we've established a catalyst where the government will help incubators and accelerators set up in the country, because we want entrepreneurs to see Bahrain and see the opportunity through Temkeen, but also through incubators and accelerators. So we've got one started around the cloud that we set up with Amazon Web Services. We have another that is around IoT. We're going to be focusing on fintech, and then we're going to have a fourth that's going to be a generalist accelerator.
I just want to pick up on something. You just mentioned Amazon. So Amazon chose Bahrain as its hub. Mm-hmm. Does it understand your strategy, and did you talk to Amazon about your strategy for job creation? And does Amazon buy into that? Because it would need to if it's going to be a major player in Bahrain and the region.
Right. Yeah, so Amazon is obviously, we talk about the Amazon on the retail side, but we talked a lot to the Amazon Web Services, which is their data center business. And a lot of people kind of don't see that side of Amazon, but
you might just need to explain to the audience what they've chosen to do.
So let me talk a bit about web services. The web services business, Amazon is a leader, so about 30% market share in the cloud is led by Amazon. Google and Microsoft are obviously very active players, but really Amazon has led the way for about 10, 12 years. And so what Amazon, it took us 2.5 years. We went to see Andy Jassy, so this is answering your question. Andy Jassy runs this business, done an amazing job as CEO of AWS to build it over the last 10 years. It's a multi-billion-dollar business, drives about a quarter of their net profit. And when we talked to Andy, it was really telling him about the Middle East. So Amazon Web Services is pretty much global. But when we looked at Africa and the Middle East, our argument was, why is there a big hole in your data center business and there's nothing in Africa and the Middle East? And Andy's view was, we're growing in China, we're growing in India, we want to continue expanding, and we can't do everything at once. And our argument to him was, you can't ignore what's happening and the dynamism of what's happening in the Middle East. And it took us about 3-4 meetings. What excited Andy and what excited Amazon was the startup initiative that we had. So they're a multi-billion-dollar business, but they still remember their days as a startup. And so when you tell them about the Middle East, the fact that we are trying to create a startup community, that the Middle East is looking for jobs, and the way to solve that problem is to get new entrepreneurs. And we saw some amazing businesses this morning. This is just a small snapshot. I've been to Jordan, Egypt. I mean, I see amazing entrepreneurs in the Middle East and saying they're looking for a home. And they're looking for a home in the Middle East. And there are examples of this in Amman, in Cairo, in Dubai, in Bahrain. And we want to be able to do that. And that was what caught their attention. So Amazon is basically the first amongst the 3 big players to decide to build a data center in the Middle East. And Bahrain is going to host that. It's a huge investment. It's 3 data centers. It's going to be providing services for the entire Middle East. It's a major commitment by Amazon. Amazon has entered the market by buying Soog.com. It's now made this second commitment to the region. And it shows you the momentum that the region has now, and the belief that major corporates have in what is happening in the Middle East. And to us, we're excited that Bahrain can host that.
Another subject that I think everybody will be aware of is the discussion around Saudi Aramco going public. And that, of course, raises the whole question of privatization and the opportunities that creates. Is there a privatization strategy for you in Bahrain that also feeds into your job creation program for people?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, this new normal in oil prices is forcing people's hand in terms of looking at privatization. And I think it's forcing the right behavior. So we look at this new normal in oil prices and say it's a blessing in disguise. I don't think we would have Vision 2030 in Saudi with the kind of boldness that it's got. We wouldn't have all of these changes happening in the Middle East, resources being priced in the way they are, with subsidies somewhat being redirected, if it wasn't for the oil prices. And so it's doing the same in privatization. I think traditionally we've seen power plants that are run privately. Bahrain has 80% of its power generation run by the private sector. We have some of the largest corporations in the world generating power that is bought by the government. But what we're going to see now is privatization in healthcare and in education. And I think it's going to throw up massive opportunities for investors. So we're going to see, at least in Bahrain, a move towards national health insurance. What that's going to mean is healthcare is pretty much free in the Middle East from the government, at least in the GCC. So government hospitals are free, and then you can go to the private hospitals if you want to pay, if you've got health insurance. And typically, the Ministry of Health has been paying for these hospitals, been paying for the doctors, and ministries of health have been operators of hospitals. And it is a massive, bill for the government. What we're going to see is governments introducing national health insurance and saying to the citizen, here's your health insurance, and now you can go to whatever hospital you want and get health care. And it's going to basically, and they're no longer going to pay for the doctors in public hospitals or for those hospitals in general. They will get it back from the health insurance company. That's going to change the dynamic. It's going to make doctors getting compensated differently. And I suspect that's going to happen in many other GCC countries. The other point we're going to see is education. Education, at least in most countries in the Middle East, is the third largest expenditure or source of spending for the governments. And I have to say, sadly enough, not producing the right results. So you're spending a lot of money, but you're not getting really the kind of education that you want to get out of, for your population. And so I suspect that's going to be the next wave.
I want to come back to education, but just back on healthcare. One of the challenges I imagine you have is as a country with a relatively small population compared to your neighbor, which has got a significantly larger population, is how do you choose which area to specialize in terms of healthcare? And do you have to coordinate with other GCC members to decide who's going to be a specialist in heart surgery, who's going to be a specialist in COPD or in other conditions, diabetes, because you can't justify becoming a center of excellence in everywhere. And does that create opportunities to choose which area to specialize in?
Yeah, I'd like to say, Tim, in an ideal world, we'd be doing that. We'd be talking and coordinating, and people would be specializing. In all honesty, that doesn't take place. So I think that the way we're going to learn to complement each other is to pick an expertise and then develop an expertise around that. So I'll give you an example. In Bahrain, we have, in one of the military hospitals, traditionally one of the strongest heart surgeons and a unit focused on heart surgery. And as you know, that's an issue in the Middle East. And it's established such an expertise that Aramco now sends a lot of their patients to that hospital in Bahrain. I'd like to say that was well thought. It happened. And we've picked that niche, and now we're going to be able to build on that niche. Diabetes is an area that is in need of more emphasis in the Middle East. Oncology, we see cancer rates growing. Oncology, I know in Bahrain, is now a focus in terms of how can we develop it. But it's not coordinated. It's difficult to coordinate on a number of levels amongst, and you want to be able to provide for your population. But I think at the moment it's really about seeing your needs, establishing a center of excellence, and then I think you see customers coming to it.
Coming back to education, which you touched on, you talked about the need for education and the importance of education. Can you just say something about how you've approached that in your own country and how that perhaps differs from your neighbors? Because I imagine you do it differently in each of the GCC countries. How does Bahrain go about it, and where does that stem from?
Well, I think we have a problem in education across the Middle East. So education started in Bahrain way back in the 1920s. So we had, I think boys' education started in 1919, schools, primary, secondary. And then for girls, it started in 1927. So
1927?
1927.
Okay,
so,
that was before women got the vote in Britain.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
So it was started very early on, and it's happened now so that you find generational, because again, for you to see the impact of education, it takes generations. So the benefits of that is that we've seen multiple generations now where the grandfathers have gone to universities and the sons, and now you see the grandchildren. And it impacted it. It's impacted on the woman. We have the highest participation rate of women in I would say, in the GCC. In the private sector, I think there's over 40% participation of women in the labor force. In the government, over 50%, almost 57% of women in government positions, and some in senior government positions, ministers. The CEO of our telecoms company was a woman. She's now become, vice CEO for the group. And so our approach to education has been early. Now, I don't want to compliment because I think there are shortcomings across the GCC. One is we need to reevaluate how we educate right now to be fit for the future. I don't think we are teaching the right skills in schools in terms of English language, and I'm talking about public schools, not private schools. And we need to look at new skill sets that we need to introduce. The second is we're in our universities, we're producing diplomas, and not everybody can come to a university like this and achieve a BA or what have you. You need vocational. You need some diplomas that allow quick entry into the job market. Germany does this extremely well. So the focus for us in Bahrain is vocational at the moment. We've just signed up with Udacity because we believe in what's happening in technology. Udacity is going to provide online courses for students. We're going to fund it only if the student passes. We're going to pilot it with about 400 students. They're going to have to be, screened. We'll pay for those 400 students, but only if they again pass. With Amazon, they introduced a program called AWS Educate. Again, these are just online, and there's some offline elements. With Amazon, they had 1,600 students sign up in Bahrain, which they said to us was higher than they've seen in India or China. So they said this is the single largest sign up we've seen in any country in the world. And it just shows you the hunger for students to get education that can allow them to get a job. When they've gotten, we see sometimes people who've gotten a legal degree who are taxi drivers. Or they've gotten a business administration degree and are working in a hotel as a receptionist. So we've got to be able to match education with the needs of the job market. And I think a BA or an MA isn't for everybody. And we have to remove the stigma of that. We have to allow courses that are short and that match the job market with the job entrance.
So it's sort of matching supply and demand?
Yes, and I think we've set up a labor market observatory that says where are jobs required now. And our view is, why don't we have more coders and programmers? Why don't we have skills that are, by the way, going to be required by women? Because frankly, when we look at unemployment in our country, a big proportion is women. And we think that the labor force has to reward opportunities for women as well. We have to find skill sets that are applicable across both sexes. So yes, we're looking at matching the job market with graduates.
I think we're almost out of time, but I guess my last question to you was, having graduated from Harvard and gone on and done all of the things that you've done, if you, knowing what you know now, what would you say to the young Khalid who's sitting in the audience looking at you and listening to you speak? So what advice have you got for yourself 10 years earlier or 15 years earlier?
Well, I personally wouldn't change anything in the way that my life is, because you learn from your mistakes, and I've made a lot of mistakes. So I wouldn't want to give advice that would say, do this, don't do that. My advice to anybody, and it would apply to myself, is always follow your passion. When you are passionate about what you do, it becomes effortless. It's what people call the flow. You excel without trying. And I think it's hard to find that path in which you are passionate, in which you get that flow. It's a process of discovery. And so what I wouldn't change is it took me a while. I studied government. I went to the Kennedy School here and I studied government. And I spent 20 years in the financial world. And I've now discovered that actually public policy is what I'm passionate about. But it took me 20 years from studying it to coming back to it. But I wouldn't change anything about those 20 years because I learned things in the private sector that prepared me for public policy. So I think that, follow your passion and keep discovering, and I think that's the biggest point of advice I'd give.